Hi guys, so now we're moving into photosynthesis. So I'm sharing and we're going to this one, which yes, this is the right one. Okay, so when we're talking about photosynthesis, really and honestly, our focus is the conversion of light energy to chemical energy. It is the main way we source energy for living things, but there are some other processes. There's one called chemosynthesis that we'll talk about also a little later, that basically they're using something other than sunlight to cause this conversion process. But other than that, it's very similar. But we're going to focus on photosynthesis because it's the main source. So you've got to remember, just in case you've forgotten, that plants are autotrophs. Specifically, they are photoautotrophs, meaning that they're making their own food using light. Photo is for light. So just in case you don't remember, let's do a quick reminder: phototrophs and heterotrophs, or an autotroph and a heterotroph. Autotrophs are organisms that produce their own food, make their own organic molecules from simple substances in their surroundings. So in this case, we're using carbon dioxide, water, and then of course sunlight. Heterotrophs are organisms that are unable to make their own food, so they live off of other organisms. This bunny is eating the plants that made their own food. If there were no plants, there would be no bunny. Heterotrophs must have autotrophs at some stage for life to occur based on our current system. So that makes us wonder about this whole concept of evolution when it comes to photosynthesis. Photosynthesis first evolved in prokaryotic organisms. So there were little bacteria, basically, prokaryotic organisms. And with these little bacteria, specifically, we focus with the cyanobacteria because they have that pigment molecule that made it possible for them to carry out photosynthesis. So cyanobacteria are early prokaryotes that are capable of photosynthesis because they have the pigmentation, the chlorophyll type pigmentation, that makes it possible to absorb that light energy and utilize it. We think that the cyanobacteria are responsible for the initial oxygenation of the atmosphere on the Earth. Because if you go far enough back looking at the fossil and rock record, there really wasn't much oxygen. And then with the advent and development and flourishing of cyanobacteria, we see the development of this oxygen-rich atmosphere. These prokaryotic photosynthetic pathways were the foundation of our eukaryotic photosynthesis. So what we're saying is that it's not that the cyanobacteria do exactly the same process and pathway that we do in our current eukaryotic plants, but it's very similar, and it was kind of the foundation in which this eukaryotic process developed. So where does photosynthesis happen? Leaves are the primary location of photosynthesis in most plants, but the reality is anywhere where we have that green pigment that will be exposed to light can perform the process of photosynthesis. So if you think about a cactus, their leaves have been modified into the little spines. The spines don't actually do photosynthesis, so the main stem body of the cactus itself is going to be doing the photosynthesis. Within these specific structures, the leaves, the stems, whatever it is that we're using, we find chloroplasts. And chloroplasts are the organelle where photosynthesis is going to occur. So organelle for the location of photosynthesis. So we're saying, okay, mostly leaves, and within the leaves specifically, it's going to occur in the chloroplasts. These Chloroplasts are going to be found mostly in the mesophyll, cells that make up the interior tissue of the leaf. So they're not going to be the outer surface or the bottom surface, either way. They're going to be kind of in the middle. Additionally, very important to understand is about the stomata. Just like we actually have openings to bring gases in and out of our system, plants do as well. The way it's done is a little different from how ours works, but we have these pores called stomata or stoma that allow in leaves that allow the carbon dioxide to come in and the oxygen to go out. We also have water leaving through these same openings, which is called transpiration. And we'll go into that in a little more detail. I mean, we mentioned it when we talked about the water cycle, but we're going to go into it a little more detail a little later. So if we know it happens in the chloroplast, then it's important for us to understand the different parts of the chloroplast. So remember we talked about the endosymbiont theory and the idea that chloroplasts and mitochondria, we think were their own free-living prokaryotes that were taken in. And one of the pieces of evidence for this is that they have a double membrane system. The initial membrane that the prokaryote had, and then the membrane formed when it was taken in by the other cell. So there's an outer membrane, we have an inner membrane space, and we have an inner membrane. Within the chloroplast, just like we have cytoplasm floating around, that everything floats around in a cell, we have stroma, which is a aqueous fluid. So it's that kind of gooey fluid that all of these pieces are going to float around in. Floating in this, we have the following. So we have a thylakoid. These are these little membranous sacs. And we stack these sacs up and they form a granum, which is singular. We typically say grana because we normally talk about more than one. Let me scooch myself. And then even inside the thylakoid, notice we have something called a lumen. So there's like an inner area for a thylakoid as well. And then we have lamella, which are kind of connecting. Okay. So chloroplasts are surrounded by a double membrane. I'll move myself over here. The stroma is the aqueous internal fluid. This is important to remember. Thylakoids form stacks known as grana. Remember, granum is singular, grana is plural, and we normally talk about it in a plural format. And chlorophyll is the green pigment in the thylakoid membrane. Okay. So the simplified formula for photosynthesis, we take 6 carbon dioxide plus 6 water plus light energy, and we get glucose and 6 oxygen molecules. The reactants would be our carbon dioxide and water, and our products would be glucose, water, and oxygen. Okay. So notice the carbon dioxide leads to the carbons in the glucose. The oxygens are going to be used specifically from the carbon dioxide. The oxygens are used to make the sugar and to make the water. The hydrogens come from the water reactant, and the oxygen that is the byproduct that's released actually comes from the oxygens that have been released off of the water at the beginning of the reactions. Okay. So tracking the atoms using a non-simplified formula is basically what we're trying to show you. So you can see where the carbon's coming from, where the oxygen's going. It's basically what I'm trying to do is have you track what makes what. Okay, so in photosynthesis, we're splitting water into hydrogen and oxygen. This is what we call a redox reaction. Reaction involving complete or partial transfer of one or more electrons from one reactant to another. So in photosynthesis, the electrons are transferred with the hydrogen that was split off the water to the carbon dioxide, which is where we reduce it to sugar. So when we're talking about a redox reaction, what we're talking about is oxidation and reduction. And so to help you remember what happens for each of those, we have a couple of possible mnemonics. The first is oil rig, O-I-L-R-I-G. The other one is kind of the one I think of, which is Leo goes grr, or I actually take it to Leo the lion goes grr. Leo and grr are the key factors there. So looking specifically at my mnemonic, Leo, lose electrons, oxidation. Gain electrons, reduction. Oxidation is lost. We're talking about the electrons, and reduction is gained. Okay, so reduction, we're taking the CO2 and notice it's going to the sugar. Oxidation, we're taking the oxygen from the water and it goes to be the loose free oxygen that we are sending. Okay. So then within this concept, we have two stages for photosynthesis, what we refer to as the light reactions or the light dependent reactions, and the Calvin cycle or the light independent reactions. If you take the idea of photosynthesis and break it down, it kind of gives you a precursor of the two reactions. Photo for the light reactions, because it depends on the light, and synthesis is where we're actually building the sugar or glucose molecule, and that happens in the Calvin cycle. So before we can really focus on those reactions, we need to make sure we have some good understanding of light and how it works, because we're talking about taking energy of light and transforming it. So think back to that whole energy transformation that we talked about with the laws of thermodynamics and everything. And we're transforming it to chemical energy. So light is electromagnetic energy. It's made up of particles of energy called photons. I know that sounds weird when we think of light as energy and it's made up of little particles, but we know that light works as a particle and as a wave. It's just a very unique molecule. It also travels in waves. So we've got particles of energy called photons and we have waves. And so the wavelength would be the distance from the crest of one wave to the crest of the next wave. Okay. This should be hopefully review from physics. If you're just now taking physics, then it may not be review yet because I don't think you get to light energy until second semester. So the entire range that we know of in terms of these frequencies is known as the electromagnetic spectrum, and that's what's shown off to the right on this page. We focus with the visible range, which is from 380 nanometers to 750 nanometers. That's the wavelengths, the distance from the crest of one wave to the crest of the next. We focus that as visible light. Okay. So short wavelengths, equal higher energy. The shorter the wavelength, the higher the energy. The longer the wavelengths, the lower the energy. So if you look, you'll notice red is in the 700 nanometers, whereas the violet is 400 nanometers. So red's going to have less energy than violet will. So when light interacts with matter, it can be reflected, it can be transmitted, so it can go through, or it can be absorbed. Pigments are specifically able to absorb visible light. So when we're talking about chlorophyll, that's a pigment, and so it's a pigment that's specifically designed to absorb visible light. The color that we see, so the green coloration we see, is actually the reflected wavelengths. So the worst thing you could do if you were trying to grow really nice, luscious plants is to give them only green light, because they're not going to get the light energy they need. They reflect the color we see. They reflect the green. So leaves are green because chlorophyll absorbs violet, blue, and red light and reflects green light. What we visibly see is what is reflected. So we have more than one type of chlorophyll. So we're going to start with chlorophyll A. It is the primary pigment for photosynthesis. It is highly involved in the light reactions or the light-dependent reactions, and it is typically kind of a blue-green pigment. So it's going to be more of a bluey-green coloration. Chlorophyll B is what we consider an accessory pigment. It also does the job and absorbs light energy, but it kind of picks up the other energy, and so it's more of a yellowy green pigment. And then we have the carotenoids. These have a much broader spectrum of colors for photosynthesis, so we can bring in a bigger variety of colors to absorb the energy. These are typically within the yellow-orange range. This is, if you think about it, carotenoids, carrots should always lead you towards that yellow-orange concept. With this, we have what we call photoprotection. The carotenoids are going to absorb and dissipate excess light energy that could actually damage the chlorophyll or could interact with the oxygen. But I want you to think about something, because we're in the fall, and right now, what's going on with with some of the leaves? We don't see it as much here as we do up in like on the East Coast of the US, but we see color change, and we're getting a lot of reds and oranges and yellows. What pigments do we think we're seeing more of, right? Okay, so quick check. A photon of which color of light would contain more energy? Yellow at 590 nanometers or purple at 410 nanometers? So purple at 410 nanometers, the shorter the wavelength, the higher the energy. Contrast heterotrophs and autotrophs. So autotrophs produce their own food from their surroundings, while heterotrophs rely on other organisms for food. So our next lesson will be on the light-dependent reactions specifically. Let's get out of this, and we'll stop sharing. Okay, so I will see you for the next lesson. Bye.